right, so now our pattern is really starting to take shape. You can see the back is done, the front we've got this half done, and now we get to start the pockets, which is one of my favorite parts about this vest. So the pockets start on a wrong side row, so you're going to have these bumps facing you. And it says to linen stitch X number of row or number of stitches. So I'll do 4, why not? And then you're going to move the rest of these stitches onto a scrap piece of yarn for now. So I'm going to move these and I'll be right back. Okay, so I have the rest of my stitches moved over to a stitch holder for now. And it really helps if you're using scrap yarn, use it similar or a smaller weight than the yarn you're working with, and make sure it's a different color so you can see it. It's easier to pull it out and it's easier to make sure that you actually got it through all your stitches. So now I'm going to cast on the number of stitches it tells me to cast on. So let's see. I'm going to cast on, let's say, I don't know, maybe 10 or so stitches. I'll go a little bit farther. Alright, that's plenty. So then I moved these to a stitch holder. This is going to be the front of the pocket later. What I'm making right now is the side as well as the inside of the pocket. So now we're just going to work this in linen stitch for the number of rows that it tells you to work, and make sure that you include any increases and decreases that are necessary on this edge during the pocket, and make sure it stays on the correct edge, on the outer edge. Don't accidentally put something over here. And so since we cast on stitches, we need to figure out what part of linen stitch we're at. So we can see here, all right, this stitch will need to be knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, slip, knit. So I'm going to start with knit. Right, so we're just going to continue working this piece back and forth until we get to the next part of the pattern. So now I've worked some rows that it's told me to work, and I'm on a right side row, and the pattern tells me to move the last X number of stitches to a scrap piece of yarn. So I'm going to move those last 4 stitches to a scrap piece of yarn. And then I'm going to just work these pocket stitches that I cast on for the number of rows that the pattern tells me. I'm just going to do it for 2 more rows. And what this does, working just the pocket portion a little bit longer, is it gives a little bit of gap at the bottom of the pocket below the seam opening. That way, if you put something in the pocket, like your phone, it's not a flat opening where everything's just going to fall right out. It gives you a little bit of a pocket for things to actually sit in. So I'm going to work 2 rows, and then we'll start the next part. And I'll just do 1 row. So now, and then it tells me to bind off these stitches. So I'm going to bind off, So I wound off. Now I'm going to grab my scissors. I'm going to cut that. All right, so now we have the pocket done. Now I'm going to pick these stitches back up. So I'm going to insert my needle back into those stitches before I remove my scrap piece of yarn. And if you've got a stitch that's a little hard to grab, you can pull up on your scrap yarn a little bit and it'll pull that stitch up a little bit. Alright, so I have those stitches back on my needle, and now I'm going to work these, the number of rows that the pattern tells me to work. Alright, so now we've worked the number of rows of the front of the pocket that the pattern calls us to do. And so we've gotten to the end of this, and now what we're going to do is we are going to move the remaining stitches from the front left piece back onto our needle. Then we'll remove our scrap piece of yarn, and then we're going to work the bottom of the front left piece. And this just joins the front back together. Oops, I actually need to work those stitches after I pick them back up. So let me do that real quick. And a quick note, you want to make sure when you pick these stitches back up, start it on the wrong side, the same direction you were going when you put them onto a stitch holder. If you start these stitches on the right side, you're going to be off, and then it's not going to line up when you join them again. So now you can see this is joined back together. We've got this nice opening for our pocket. There's the rest of the pocket. This will get seamed down when we're finished. But you can see now we have a pocket, a completely seamless pocket. And now we're just going to work this to the bottom, the number of rows that the pattern tells us to do. Okay, so now I've worked the rest of the rows of the front left bottom, and I am ready to bind off. And then I will be done with the front left other than seaming. So I have the front left part bound off, done, and now we're ready to pick these stitches back up and work the front right of the vest. So since we were moving this way when we put these on a stitch holder and we didn't get to work this direction with these, I'm going to pick them back up and we're going to start in this direction. And really, it doesn't matter so much for this part. It's really the pocket that matters a lot more, that you start in the right direction so things line up when you join back together. Since this doesn't get joined back together, it's not quite as important. So we've picked these back up. We're going to be moving this direction, and we are going to start off by getting rid of those yarn overs. So let's see. We've got purl. This one's a slip stitch. I need to slip with the yarn in front. So I'll slip and then I'll move my yarn in. And now we've reached the gap. We've got the yarn over and the next stitch. So we are going to purl these two together. And then we'll slip and purl. And since this one's supposed to be slipped, we're going to slip the yarn over and the next stitch, and then purl and slip, and then we'll turn it back around and we'll knit this stitch, slip this, and then we'll knit these 2 stitches we slipped together to get rid of that yarn over. And then we'll do our short rows. We'll do our armhole, waist shaping and pockets as stated in the pattern, just as we did for this side. So I'll meet you again when I've got my right front side finished, and then we'll be ready to seam and finish the whole pattern up. Alright, so we got rid of all of our yarn overs. Now we'll start the short rows. We're going to work to the last number of stitches that the pattern says. I'm using 3 as my arbitrary pattern for this sample. We'll turn, we'll make a yarn over, I'm gonna go this way, and I'm going to slip, and then I'm going to work across, and then we'll turn again, and we'll work to the number of stitches before the yarn over that the pattern says. I'll do 2. Let's see. And then I will turn. I'm going to yarn over and work to the end. I'll turn it, and now I'm going to get rid of all those yarn overs again. So I'll slip. Let's see. Oh, that's a purl. Purl, slip. Now I've reached a yarn over, so I'm going to purl those 2 together. Slip, I've reached another yarn over, I'm going to purl those 2 together. Slip, and purl. So we've got all the short rows completely finished for the whole pattern. And then we'll start the neckline for this side. So once again, we're going to work across. I'm going to turn, and I'll cast on the number of stitches that the pattern tells me to cast on. And then I'm going to work across those in pattern. So we've got, let's see, I need a purl, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip. So I'll slip, purl, and I'll work across, and then I will continue to do all the, and I'll work across, I'll turn, I'll work back across, and then when I get to the end, I'll cast on the number of stitches that the pattern tells me to cast on. And then I'm going to once again just check. Let's see. Let's see. I'm going to take just maybe a couple of those off. I'm not actually counting right now. So then once again I'm going to check. So I start off in pattern. And let's see, we've got, what do we have going on here? Let's see, it'll be slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl. So I'll start with a purl. And then I'm going to continue this in pattern until I get to the armhole. And it's going to be, let's see, it'll be the same as it was for the other side, where we'll just increase on the edge to add more stitches for the armhole, and then we'll work our decreases and increases on this outer edge. Make sure you don't put increases and decreases in the center, only on the outer edge, and then I will meet you back when it's time for the pocket. Now we've made it all the way to the right front half pocket. So we're going to work the first number of stitches it tells us to work. I'm going to go ahead and just pick 4 again, and then we'll move the rest of the stitches onto a scrap piece of yarn or stitch holder. If you got one of those clips, those work great. Just depends how many stitches you have. I think scrap yarn really works the best. But we're going to work this just like we did for the left side. Alright, and then I'm going to tie a knot in that just to make sure my stitches don't come off. Right, and then I'm going to cast on the number of stitches that it tells me to cast on. Okay, and now I'm going to work my way across in pattern. So let's see, I'm going to need to purl, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl, slip. So I'll go ahead and do that. And then we'll once again work these stitches to where it says, and then we'll bind on, or we'll move these first 4 stitches onto a stitch holder and work just these a few more rows, the number of rows it says, and bind these off for the pocket. And then I'll meet you when we pick these up. Okay, so now I've finished this part of the pocket. I got to the bottom, I moved these stitches onto my stitch holder, worked a few more rows here and bound off, and now I'm ready to pick these back up. So I'm going to put these stitches back on my needle. And since we were moving, hang on. Since we were on the right side moving this direction when we moved these onto a stitch holder, we're going to start going this direction, picking them back up. So we're going to, in this case, to continue in pattern, I'm going to slip the first stitch. Just work in pattern, whatever stitch you're at. And then I'm going to work across the row in pattern. And we're just going to continue working across these stitches until the pattern tells us to stop. So I've worked the number of rows that the pattern says to work, and now I'm ready to move these stitches back onto my needle. So I'm going to pick them back up. remove my scrap piece of yarn, and I will work across them in pattern. And now that that's all joined back up, I will continue to work this again to this is the front right bottom of the vest, and I will now continue to work this until it tells me to bind off. So yours should look much bigger, but something somewhat similar to this. You got the back, and then it separates for the front pieces. And now we're going to seam it. So I'm going to start with this edge, and when I bound off, I just left myself a really long tail, and that way I can use that to do my seam, and then it's one less thing I need to weave in my yarn. So I'm going to use a mattress stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up one stitch on the edge, and then I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go down, and I want to pick up an actual stitch. I don't want to pick up a slipped stitch. I want to pick up an actual stitch. And then I'll go down here where I came out below, and I'll come back up with a stitch. And then over here, I'll come down where I was and up for a stitch. And I'll just keep going back and forth. I can do a more in-depth tutorial on mattress stitch for another video. So then I pull that tight, and we've got it seamed. So I'm going to seam all the way up the side and up this side, and then I'll show you how to sew the pockets down. We are almost done. I've got my sides seamed. The vest is just about done. All I have to do now is sew the pockets down, and then I'm going to weave in my ends. So all that's left now is just seaming the inside of this pocket down so that it's actually a closed pocket. So you can use an actual needle and thread for this if you'd like, or you can just use some thin yarn and a tapestry needle, yarn needle, whatever you want to call it. And if you're going to use yarn, or if you're using thread, whatever you're using, make sure that it's pretty similar in color to this, just so it doesn't show through to the other side. So I'm going to start at one edge, and if you start at the bottom, remember there's these extra rows, and so you're going to want to start in the corner. If you start down here, there's going to be a gap right there. So I'll go ahead and start at the bottom, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to go down into the edge of the pocket, and then I'm going to leave enough that I can weave it in later, and then I'm going to grab the top of a stitch, or you can go through the stitch if you'd like in the back. Just make sure that you don't go in and grab a full stitch, because then you're going to see it at the bottom. Everything you're grabbing should be a purl stitch that's on this side, and that way you're not going to see it. And then after I go on that side, I'm going to grab a stitch, the edge over here on the pocket, and then I'm going to pick up another stitch from the back, and again you can go through the stitch if you'd like. Just makes it a little bit more secure. And I'll pull that a little bit tight, and I'll keep going. I'll pick up a stitch along the edge of the pocket, and I'll seam it to the inside of the vest. And I'll just keep going like that all the way around. Now we have both pockets seamed, so I can use the pocket. It's enclosed. That's all done. I have my ends all woven in, And all that's left now is to pick up the stitches along the collar and knit the collar. And so there's just one little thing I'm going to explain in the collar, and then we'll be done. So when you pick up your stitches, it's a pick up and knit. So you're going to find your first stitch and insert your needle, and you're going to wrap your yarn around and pull it through just like normal. Now if you look, you can see each row of stitches. You can either go right above or between. I'm going to go right above. So you can see at the top where I bound off, that little loop, that is my stitch. I'm going to wrap and pick up, and I'm going to continue to do that until I get to the vertical edge. So the vertical edge, it's not as visible in my sample because my sample is so small, but you're going to have a few rows here that are just up and down instead of across, and it's the distance between the shoulder and the neckline. For these, since you're not picking up the top of a stitch, you're picking up the side of a stitch, you want to pick up essentially every other stitch. If you picked up every stitch, you'd be picking up the slipped stitch and the knit stitch, but those take up the space of one standard stitch. So you're going to pick up one stitch, then skip that slipped stitch and put your needle in there and pick it up. So essentially you're going to pick up a stitch between every slipped stitch. And I'm just going to keep making my way around the collar and pick up each stitch that I get to. So once we're back to a horizontal edge, you can see at the top of each stitch there's these two bars. It looks like a standard knit stitch. I'm going to put my needle underneath both sides of that, wrap my yarn around, and pull my stitch out. You can grab just the front half if you want, but I like to make it just a little bit more secure, and I think it becomes more secure that way. If I pick up just the front stitch of that, I think it pulls a little bit and you might end up with some holes. So my advice is to pick up the entire stitch there. And now I'm back to a vertical section, as short as it may be in my sample, and so I want to make sure that I am not picking up the slipped stitches, only the full stitch. So that's what, when your instructions say skip the slipped stitches, that's what it's talking about. Alright, so now I've made it all the way around my collar, and I'm just going to work in linen stitch back and forth until my collar is as long as I want it to be. And I believe it says 15 rows in pattern. And remember that we're now on the wrong side, so start on the wrong side row of the collar. If you want, you could do a reverse stitch and make the collar this part of the stitch so it stands out a little bit. Go right ahead. If you want to do that, you're going to start on a right side row of linen stitch. That's completely up to you. I'm going to start on a wrong side row because I want my collar to match the front. That's what I did in the sample. So I'm just going to go ahead and start knitting in linen stitch all the way across until my collar is as long as I want, and then I'm going to bind off, weave in my ends, and we'll be done. So I now have my collar as long as I want to make it for this sample, and I'm just going to show you one last tip or trick for you, and it has to do with binding off. If you want to bind off in pattern, what you can do is, I've got a slipped stitch here that I'm starting with, so I'm going to knit, and I already started binding off a few stitches, and then I'll pass that stitch over, And then instead of knitting this, I'm just going to slip with my yarn in front as usual and slip that stitch over. And that way I don't have a longer set of stitches right under my bind off that have not been worked in pattern. The full bind off will look just like the rest of it. So when I get to a stitch that I would slip this row, I'm slipping it as usual, and then slipping my first stitch over the second to bind off. And then I knit, and I slip my stitch over, and then I slip a stitch and pass this stitch over. I knit a stitch and I pass this stitch over. And by doing that, everything remains nice and tidy and looks really even. And that is everything that you'll need to know to make the hiker's vest.